Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are kicking off a complete guide to function calling, the feature that lets the Gen AI models actually take real world actions. So this is a three-part series. In this first part, we will go over the core concepts and walk through the entire function calling flow so that you really understand how it all works and what happens under the hood. Alright, let's jump in. Function calling. Function calling, also known as tool calling, provides a powerful way for the generative AI models to interact, to talk to external systems and access data outside their training data. Now we know that these models have been trained on vast amount of data, but this data has a cutoff date. That means that they might not know what's happening today or what's today's weather, right? And that's where function calling or tools help the generative AI models to extend their capabilities. So function calling has three primary use cases. The first one that we just spoke about is augmenting knowledge, which allows them to access information from external sources like databases and knowledge bases. So here, knowledge bases could be your own documents related to your use case, which the model may not have access to, or domain specific information. Second is external capabilities. Tools allow the GenAI models to use external tools to perform computations, such as calculations, creating charts, or even executing Python code. And third is to take actions. This allows them to interact with the external systems or so-called the real world by interacting with APIs. So you may have seen examples where the Gen AI models are able to schedule appointments or send emails automatically. And that's all possible because of tool calling. Now, before we understand the process or the what happens under the hood of calling, let's first understand a few terminologies here which will help us understand the concept better. Tools. Tools is nothing but the functionality that we give the model. It's a capability that we tell the model to use, and depending on the prompt that the user gives, the model may decide to use the tool or may not decide to use the tool. So it all depends on the kind of prompt or the query that the user asks. So the smartness here is the model decides whether it needs the tool or not. That's first. And then if it needs the tool, it's able to use it, and we'll show how it's able to use it. Next is tool calls. These are requests from the model to use tools. A very important thing to understand is GenAI models do not inherently have the capability to use tools. We know that they are able to predict the next token, but they cannot do things beyond predicting the next token. So that's where the GenAI model actually helps us to tell which tool to call and with what parameters to call that tool with. And once we have this information, we execute the code on our end, on the application end. So we'll talk about the function calling process in a moment. But right now, what is important to understand is the generative AI models do not have the capability to use the tools. So tool call is like a special kind of response which the model gives after reading the prompt. When a user sends a prompt, the model may decide that it needs to use the tool. And what it does is it inspects the prompt and it concludes that it needs either some external data to respond to the prompt, or it may need to perform an action. So for example, if you ask the model what is the weather in Paris, we just discussed that the model does not have present information. So then it look for the tools that the application has given to it, or if we are the developer, it look for the tools that the developer has provided to the GenAI model in order to respond to that prompt. Now next is tool call output. This is the output we generate for the model. Now we just said that there is something called as tool calls where the model tells us which tool to use and with what parameters. So what the model returns is structured data with the tool name and the parameters that we should execute that tool with. For example, it will say run current weather tool with the parameter location equal to Boston. What we do, or what the application code is supposed to do is the application actually executes the tool. It produces an output and then it feeds it back to the model so that the model then can finish the natural response and send that response to the user. So you may have guessed that here we are calling the model twice. The first time when we the first time when the user queries or when the user sends a prompt to the model responds to the application saying which tool to use and with what parameters. Then the application runs that code and it sends the response, sends the tool call output back to the model, and then the model is able to generate the final response. An example prompt: what's the weather in Paris, that we just saw. Now here what happens is the model proposes a tool call like we saw in the previous point. It says call this tool with this parameter, and then we parse that response and we check if there is a tool call. If there is a tool call, then it is our responsibility or the application code's responsibility to execute this function. And then once this function gets executed, and for example, it returns this response, we return this response to the model. So then the model in a way summarizes that information and responds back in natural language. So the model's final answer is the weather in Paris today is 25 degrees. Now here, if you see carefully, the model is not actually calling or executing the code, right? The application code is. I keep using this terminology interchangeably, right? Tool and function. So let's understand the difference. A tool is like a superset. It's the umbrella term. It's any capability that you provide to the model. Now, a function is a subset. It is a schema defined tool. So a tool is described with the JSON schema. We'll look at an example to make this clear. But when we provide a tool to the generative AI model, we provide a schema to it. And in that schema, we specify the name of the function and the parameters that the function accepts and the data type of those parameters. That's what we are referring to as typed parameters. The second is custom tools. Custom tools are mostly free text input and output. They are not strictly defined. They do not have a strictly defined schema. You can think of this as Python code generators, right? Which is able to generate Python code. And then there are built-in platform tools. These are tools that are provided by the platform. For example, web search, code execution, and so on. In this case, we don't have to write them from scratch. We'll probably just enable them or configure them. Now, again, a note to keep in mind is this. The application code is responsible for executing the function tool or the code. The model does not execute the tool, and this is a very important thing. This is a very important takeaway from this topic of function calling. Now let's look at the function calling flow. This is where you'll understand what happens under the hood. Okay. Now there are actually three important layers here. One is a user. This is someone who's interacting with the front end UI. Okay. An application. Think of an application like a web app or a web interface like a chatbot UI. Model is the generative AI model. It would be hosted somewhere, which you'll call through an API. And then this is a different API. This is a separate API which performs some form of action. Okay, this is different from the model. Now, if you look at the steps, a user sends a prompt to the application, which is the chatbot user interface. In the application code, we have defined the model client, like we've used Gemini, and then while defining the model, we have provided the functions or the tools that the model has access to. Now, so here when the user sends a prompt to the application sends the prompt as well as the function declarations to the model. Okay. The model then decides whether it's able to respond to the prompt using the data that it is trained on, or it may decide to use a tool that the application has provided. So if at all it uses a tool, it returns two things to the application. It returns the function identifier, meaning the name of the function, and it returns the parameters, meaning what argument values should the application use to run the function. So then when the application receives the name of the function and the parameters, so in the application, the response of the model is parsed and we check, and the application code checks if there is a tool call. And if a tool call is found, in that tool call, it will extract the name of the function, name of the tool, and the parameters, and then it will do a function call. Now imagine as part of that function, we are calling an API. So in short, what we are doing here is the application code is executing that code or executing that function. And as part of the function, an API gets called with a request, and the API responds with some payload. So again, the application parses that response, kind of an output from the API, and it sends it back to the model. The model then takes in this response or the tool output, and it creates a final response. It generates a final response and sends it to the application. The application then exposes that response to the user. So here on the front end, the user only sees two things. The user sends the prompt and receives a response from the model. But at the back end, these many things are happening. And that's it for part one. You now know exactly what happens behind the scenes in a function calling flow. In the next part, we'll get hands-on. We'll set up the free Gemini API key and we'll try a real-world example using the function calling flow that we just discussed. See you there.